Hello, everyone. Lane Ridenhour here for our combined Sunday school classes from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. With our campus and our buildings closed for the time being, we're continuing to offer our Sunday worship via live stream and our Sunday school classes here virtually, and we're so glad that you're able to be with us. We want to remind you, as usual, the church is not a building, it's a people. In the Bible, the word church is the translation of the Greek term ecclesia, which means a calling out. It never refers to a building or a meeting place, but always to the people, the ones who are called out of the world's society by God, calling them into His service. We'll begin our Sunday school class today with the singing of a hymn, Softly and Tenderly, Jesus is Calling. It's a classic hymn of invitation from the 19th century, written in 1880 by Will Thompson. Now, in addition to being a composer of secular and patriotic and gospel songs, Mr. Thompson was also a music publisher. When his songs were rejected by the publishers of the day, he decided to form his own publishing company. And by the 1880s, that company had expanded beyond publishing to include the sale of pianos and organs and other instruments and supplies. The Thompson brand of piano was still sold even in this region up until 1959. Back in the late 1800s, many worshipers attended revival services, and that tradition included the extended invitation hymn, sometimes called an altar call hymn, at the conclusion of the service, where those who were in attendance might be called on by the Holy Spirit to come down to the altar and make either a profession of faith or a recommitment of their lives. Softly and Tenderly is the quintessential altar call song. The Reverend Carlton Young, who was the editor of the United Methodist Hymnal years ago, described Softly and Tenderly as a lullaby, a typical lullaby in the gospel fashion that characterized Jesus as a mother, rocking and comforting her child. I'll put the words up on the screen, so do feel free to sing along. This is Softly and Tenderly. Softly and tenderly Jesus is calling, calling for you and for me. Patiently Jesus is waiting and watching, watching for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home. Why should we tarry when Jesus is pleading, pleading for you and for me? Why should we linger and heed not his mercies, mercies for you and for me? Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home. Time now is fleeting, the moments are passing, passing from you and from me. Shadows are gathering, deathbeds are coming, coming for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home. Oh, for the wonderful love he has promised, promised for you and for me. Though we have sinned, he has mercy and pardon, pardon for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home.
The Greek writer Sophocles said, "Without labor, nothing prospers." The sages teaching in the royal wisdom schools in the courts around Jerusalem would certainly agree. They valued industriousness. They were trying to teach it to their young charges because they saw it as essential for success in their setting. The editors who compiled the book of Proverbs also would agree. When they were thinking about how people interested in God and interested in God's wisdom could find it and be successful, they wrote these things down and passed them on to us. What I find really interesting when I approach this topic is that to make these lessons, they spend a good deal of time talking about the opposite of what they want, laziness or slackness, and what those characteristics yield. Certainly, they do talk about diligence and give it some content, but they definitely emphasize the former, and that choice is interesting too for reasons we're going to explore. Let me start today by going to Proverbs chapter 20, verse 4. It reflects the agricultural environment that gives rise to much of what we're going to read on this topic. Makes sense because village wisdom was the foundation for royal or court wisdom. What that common sense learned from nature perspective teaches was important. Here's what that proverb says. The lazy person does not plow in season. Harvest comes and there's nothing to be found. The Hebrew's a little bit more interesting here. It says after the autumn, which is the time right before the rainy season starts, when you have to be preparing and planting if you're going to get everything watered the way that it needs to be watered and growing and harvested on time. It says the lazy one's not plowing. That one, the conclusion says, will beg during the harvest and have nothing. Now, for people who work the land and depend on it to eat, the lesson is simple and the lesson is obvious. You don't work the land, you don't plant, you don't tend, and you're not going to have any produce. Proverbs 12:11 gives us the same thought, as does a like proverb 28:19. It begins, the tillers or workers of their land will be satisfied with bread. You do the work, you get the outcome. But the opposite person is characterized in some interesting ways. In 12:11 it says, this is one who is pursuing emptiness or vanity. That is, they are doing worthless things. They're engaged in pursuits that aren't going to lead to the result they want to see. And they are pictured or described as ones lacking heart. Here that means inner will or character. They're just not disciplined and directed and formed in such a way that they can keep their eye on the prize. Now in 28:9, the outcome is poverty. What they are trying to tell us is the things that constitute laziness. People who get distracted easily. It relates directly to Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 to 11, which is one of my very favorite short sections, because it's based on observation of the created order, which is something that wisdom sages like to do. They said if we just watch what the creation does, we learn about God's wisdom, and then we can follow it or live in harmony with it. And so this lesson says, go to the ant, lazy one, see her ways, and be wise. Now here's the situation. The person says, I look at this ant and I see, without a commander, a keeper, or a ruler, that is, without somebody telling the ant what to do, the ant makes ready her bread in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. The teacher then sits back and poses a question. How long, lazy one, will you lie down? When are you going to rise from your sleep? Now again, remember we're dealing primarily with adolescents, and adolescents sleep a lot. Sleep here can be read literally, but it's also a million other things. Sleep can be too much distraction, too much rest, too much unwillingness to do what you have to do. Here's the phrase, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little clasping of the hand to lie down. That's taking a break, napping. And you get poverty coming to you like a prowler, and need like someone who is armed. In short, it doesn't take too much before things get out of hand and you lose everything that you should have, or you don't gain it in the first place. We get this imagined for us in another longer agricultural section that ends with the same phrase about slumber and sleep and napping. And here the fields of the lazy one and the vineyards of the ones lacking heart are described as chaotic. They're overgrown with nettles or thorns, covered in thistles. The walls that are supposed to keep out predators are broken down. In other words, they haven't been tended appropriately, and everything has gone riot again. Remember, in the creation, God orders the chaos. And so if one is working in a way that is opposed to the creation, chaos is what's going to ensue. It may seem easy, but young students in a wisdom setting, we have to recognize, are likely going to yawn at such stories. They make sense to people who depend on the success of their fields to survive, but for these young people who are going to work in an urban court setting of some kind, they are distant ideas. They are not going to feel, as Proverbs 10:5 says, shamed at their lack of gathering, because that's not how they get fed. Such messages are probably distant to many of us as well, and so it's important that the writers and editors and compilers of the book of Proverbs extended them into other settings. Chapter 10, verse 4 says, a slack or a negligent hand causes poverty, as opposed to the hand of the diligent making one rich. Now, ears might perk up here. Money, or really accumulated possessions, can be a big motivator. For those elite young men in the wisdom schools, it's not beyond the pale to think they all feel somewhat responsible for eventually having to maintain a household at a certain level of comfort. We, too, might appreciate the fact that if we want to have some of the finer things and maintain them, we need to have something more than a slack hand. This idea takes root, and we get a series of teachings about the diligent and the lazy. Diligent here is a word, charutz, that means sharp or strict. It's somebody who can cut through to the essential things. We're meant to get an imagined picture of a person who is on top of things. And you know how organized people function. They always seem to have a plan. They always seem to keep things moving along in an ordered and careful and thoughtful way. We're told in Proverbs that people who have this trait will not only be successful in terms of their means, but also will rule, and that's what they want. I like Samuel Johnson, the writer, on this point when he says, "What we hope ever to do with ease, we must first learn to do with diligence." What I think we're getting here is something that every diligent person knows. What looks easy actually took a lot of effort. You have to practice. And every new circumstance is going to give you something different to consider. Yet if you work at it and you've developed a toolbox, you have the ability to address those concerns when they come along. You trust your ability to handle the situation. By contrast, the lazy person, and here in several cases we get a word that means negligent or slack, is someone who will find themselves forced into labor or will have other outcomes they don't end up liking. First of all, they won't be able to roast their own game. I like this one. It basically says, well, you can't enjoy the feast if you don't go out and hunt the animal. Other cases, it just says they're going to be hungry. But one of my favorites is 21:5, who says the person who comes up wanting is hasty. That is, in contrast to a diligent person who has thought the things through, understood what the circumstance is, what they need to do, and created a plan to achieve it. This person is one who just slapdash throws it together and hopes for the best. That is not, the teachers are telling us, an optimal way to achieve success. Another idea comes in Proverbs 14:23, which says, "In all toil there is profit or advantage, but mere talk just leads to poverty." Everybody knows this person. Always lots of talk about their grandiose plans and what they're going to do and how wonderful it's going to be, but a shortage of action. All bluster, no solid effort. Can you sit back and begin to see the pattern here? Not just on the surface, but one deeper. You've got a group of fairly advantaged people being trained in a certain kind of life, but they are being told something rather harsh. It's not, you have advantages, kick up your feet and enjoy the leisure of working in the court. You can't take it for granted that you will have this wonderful, easy life. You need to acquire skills, you need to apply them, and you need to work hard if you're going to have a truly meaningful or enriched life. Now, I have to stop at this point because I want us to get something fundamental here. It is easy, all too easy, for people hearing these words to focus on the negative. That is, the fools and the slackers and the lazy. We too often do this in a blaming way. If a person is materially poor or their circumstances are limited, we can blame the individual. Well, they must be lazy or unwilling to work. If somebody doesn't advance in their profession or live out the American dream, they must not have tried hard enough. They must not be as clever or as driven as I am. We make such statements, or we have these ideas, often as a way of creating a hedge around our own circumstances. It's a way of walling ourselves off from the real dangers, imagining that we have some control over our circumstances because we do what we should. And it can blind us to the advantages we bring coming in. The writers of Proverbs, however, are really pushing those young men to see how laziness and slackness is something that they are engaged in, that they are tempted by because of their advantaged position. Let me show you the direction that they're pushing us. Let's start with Proverbs 18:9. One who is slack in work is close kin to a vandal. The translator here chooses slack for the participle mithrafeh. It's a verbal root that means sinking or relaxing or letting go or being limp. It's supposed to give us the idea of sloth, not making much effort. And the proverb says that slothful person is kin to a ruinous one or a corrupter. Here's the picture. If creation is this ordered system where God's wisdom is infused, and you are not doing the work that that system requires of you, then you're corrupting the system. And that's an indictment of them for not taking seriously their responsibilities. They're vandalizing the very thing that they should be working to maintain. A favorite image in this regard is one that comes up in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 24. It says, when you're lazy, you advantaged one. It's like you've buried your hand in the dish. And the word for buried here is hide it or conceal it even. You really dug into the food. But then you won't even bother to bring that hand to your mouth. Get the mental picture here. You have all of the advantages in the world. You've got a table with abundant food that you can put your hand down in until it disappears. But you fail to appreciate it as a resource. And again, it doesn't have to be just food. I'm going to think about some of the students that I encounter, not all of them by any means, but the ones who have all of the world laid out before them, every advantage that an education could offer them. And yet they get to campus and they're like, I'm not going to go to class, or I'm only going to do what it takes to get by and nothing else. They don't want to put themselves out. They aren't grasping the opportunity that's right there in front of them. And this is the picture that these young men are being drawn, saying, you're sitting here in this incredible setting, pounce on the opportunity to find that enriched or fulfilled life by applying yourself fully to it, because enrichment is going to come to you the harder you work at it. It gets me to another one, which I think is pretty funny, Proverbs 22:13, which is all about the crazy, stupid excuses people make for why they can't work. This is a favorite. Well, there's a lion outside. I'll be killed in the streets. You go, what? This is the excuse for not getting out and doing the work. If I walk out the door, then this ferocious lion, as if lions are wandering in the streets every day, is gonna gobble me up. Again, I'll give you a teaching example. The dog ate my homework, or my computer crashed. There's always a reason for the lazy ones why they couldn't get it done. Proverbs sums it up and says, we don't buy it. None of this lying in the street, none of this laying around in bed, none of this putting your hand in the dish and not being able to even get it back to your mouth. What does that say about the person? Well, look at this in 26:16. The lazy person is wiser in self-esteem than 7 who can answer directly. Literally, that reads, Wise is the lazy one in their own eyes, more than 7 who turn back or answer sensibly, discerningly, or with judgment. In short, laziness often expresses itself in an exaggerated sense of self. The person thinks, I'm smarter, I'm more capable than anybody else, and I don't need to be told anything. That person looks a fool to the world because no amount of bluster, no amount of talk, no amount of excuses can make up for the fact that they are not functioning well. Simple example. I can't be a doctor without engaging the necessary learning, or I will do harm. And it's not simply that I have to get the degree and start my practice, but I always have to be learning because there's always something more to know. Same way with parenting. You can't be a good parent without making the investment in a child. And it's not something you do just one day. You have to keep at it. I can't be a good leader if all I can offer is, look how great I am. If I'm not out there doing the work that supports the team that's looking to me, then I am not a leader. These words are still then also for us. In spite of everything going on in the world today, we are still affluent, sitting in the class being taught here. We have so much as individuals and as a country, and yet we're too often willing to squander everything. I want to do this last section with a quote from the Dalai Lama, who talks about 3 kinds of laziness, and I want to go at it with each kind and give you an example. The Dalai Lama says, one can be deceived by 3 types of laziness. The laziness of indolence, which is the wish to procrastinate. Do we too often not work hard for the outcomes that we want, whether those outcomes be in our families or in our communities? Do we sometimes just think, oh, it'll magically get better, or I'll handle that tomorrow? That's the kind of laziness that never leads to change. The Dalai Lama says there is the laziness of inferiority, which is doubting your own capabilities. Let me go to a social issue here. I was shocked to learn this week that we live in a country where 52% of all adults have basic or below basic reading skills. 36% of all Americans read at a 6th to 8th grade level, and only 12% read at a 9th or 10th grade level or higher. It's worse with numbers. 64% are basic or below basic in fundamental math skills, 27% in that 6th to 8th grade level, and only 9% 9th or 10th grade level or higher. All of the advantages we have as a country, why do we not take this on? Are we afraid that we are not capable of solving the problem? We could apply this to anything. We could apply it to hunger. We could apply it to the desperate circumstances that we find our economy in as the result of the pandemic. We could apply it to climate change. We could apply it to anything. Are we doubting our capability to achieve and thus doing nothing? A third, the Dalai Lama says, is the laziness that is attachment to negative actions or putting great effort into non-virtue. This one is about our priorities. Where do we place them? Do we sometimes spend our time going after nothingness, vanity, emptiness, as we saw earlier, rather than attending to our responsibilities and the things that make for virtue? It's a tough question. Our results may not always be actual hunger or actual poverty. But if we choose the road of the lazy or the slack, we are letting ourselves down and letting our communities down, because we live in a place and in a time that needs our diligence, our drive, our labor. Wisdom, God's wisdom, exemplified for us in the creation, is calling us, the sages tell us, to this task, to industriousness. Will we heed that call? Will we listen to that prompt? Think about it this week. Thank you.